The kitchen smelled of burnt oil and broken dreams, tucked in the lowest level of Station Arcturus, where the air tasted metallic and hope came in rations. A human chef stood at a fryer that had seen better decades, his daughter clutching a worn recipe book against her chest, her purple skin glowing in the golden light of frying dough. When Magistrate Valora descended with her council of critics, no one expected the widower to speak, let alone cook. But what emerged from that battered fryer would shake the foundations of galactic cuisine forever. Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from. And if stories like this move you, hit that subscribe button because tomorrow's episode is even more unbelievable than this one. The fryer hissed like a dying star, steam curling toward vents that barely worked anymore. Garrett Hayes stood before it, with the posture of a man who had long stopped expecting mercy from the universe. His white chef's coat, once pristine, now bore the stains of 1,000 shifts in Station Arcturus's sub-level commissary, the kind of kitchen where ambition went to fossilize. Around him, the lunch rush clattered with alien voices. Threxians with their clicking mandibles, Vayari whose skin pulsed with bioluminescent annoyance, Korvath whose multiple eyes never quite focused on him. They came for rations, not cuisine. Compressed protein bars. Nutrient paste in 17 flavors that all tasted like recycled air. Sometimes, when the supply ships remembered Earth existed, he'd get potatoes, flour, sugar. On those days, he made donuts. Simple rings of fried dough, dusted with whatever sweetener hadn't expired. The aliens laughed. They called it primitive, wasteful. A Threxian guard once held one between two claws like it might contaminate him, dropped it theatrically, and crushed it beneath his boot while his companions wheezed with laughter. Garrett had scraped it up without a word, cleaned the floor, made more the next day. In the corner, perched on a stool too tall for her, sat Sierry, 7 years old, purple skin catching the fluorescent light like a bruise trying to heal. Her eyes, too large for her small face, watched everything. She held a book against her chest, its cover cracked leather, its pages yellowed with time and touch. Her mother's recipe book. Garrett glanced at her between batches. She smiled, small and fierce, and his chest tightened the way it always did when he remembered why he kept cooking at all. The lunch crowd thinned. A Korvath engineer muttered something about humans and their obsession with grease as he paid for his paste. A Vayari administrator didn't even look at Garrett when she took her tray. Invisible. That's what he'd become in the 2 years since Liana died. Not to Sierry, though. Never to her. She hopped off the stool, recipe book clutched tight, and crossed to where he was draining the last batch. Her fingers, three-jointed and delicate, reached for a warm donut. She bit into it with the reverence of prayer, and her eyes closed. Mama would be proud, she whispered in that lilting accent that was neither his nor Liana's but somehow both. Garrett's throat closed. He turned back to the fryer before she could see his face. Above them, through the ceiling, footsteps echoed, heavy, official, the kind that meant inspections, quotas, and questions he never had good answers for. Sierry heard them too. Her ears, slightly pointed, twitched upward. She looked at him with sudden worry, and he forced a smile he didn't feel. The footsteps grew louder, closer, descending. Sierry's fingers traced the edges of her mother's recipe book the way other children traced the faces of those they'd lost in photographs. The leather cover was warm from being held against her chest, soft from 2 years of constant touch. Inside, pages filled with Liana's careful script, diagrams drawn in fading ink, notes in the margins written in 2 languages, sometimes 3. She couldn't remember her mother's face clearly anymore. The details blurred like frost on glass when you breathed too close. But she remembered the kitchen. The apartment they'd shared before the accident, before the station reassigned them to smaller quarters, before her father stopped talking about anything but shift schedules and supply requisitions. She remembered her mother's hands, green-skinned and graceful, showing her father how to fold dough, how to listen to the sound it made, the small sighs and whispers that meant it was ready. Her mother had laughed often in those days, a sound like water over stones, and her father had laughed with her. Sayuri opened the book to a page marked with a dried flower, its petals long since turned to paper. The recipe there was titled simply, Heritage Rings. Beneath it, her mother had written in smaller script, For the days when you forget why simple things matter. The measurements were precise, the instructions meticulous, but in the margins, her mother had added something else. Let Garrett read this when he's ready. Tell him I chose him not despite his simplicity, but because of it. Tell him the galaxy needs teachers more than it needs masters. Sayuri had read those words 1,000 times. She didn't fully understand them yet, but she felt their weight, felt the way they pressed against her ribs when she watched her father move through the kitchen like a ghost haunting his own life. She looked up as he scraped the fryer clean, his movements efficient and empty. He never made the complicated things anymore, never attempted the layered pastries her mother had taught him, the delicate work that required patience and hope in equal measure. Just donuts. Simple, round, easy to mock. But Sayuri had tasted what he made when he thought she wasn't paying attention. The moments when his hands remembered before his heart could stop them. The texture was perfect, the sweetness balanced, the way the exterior gave way to soft interior like a secret being, shared. He was still the chef her mother had loved. He just didn't believe it anymore. The footsteps above grew thunderous. Sayuri closed the book and held it tighter. She knew what inspections meant, knew that the station's Culinary Council had been threatening to shut down human food services entirely. Too inefficient, they said. Too primitive. Resources better spent on automated nutrition dispensers. Her father glanced at her, and she saw the resignation in his eyes. He expected to lose, expected to be moved to waste reclamation or atmosphere maintenance, expected the kitchen, small and battered as it was, to be taken away. Sayuri stood straighter on her stool. She was 7 years old, purple-skinned, and small enough to be overlooked by nearly everyone on the station. But she remembered what her father had forgotten, and she would make them remember too. The doors split open with a hiss that silenced the few remaining diners. Magistrate Valora entered, like winter, arriving early. Her green skin luminous under the harsh commissary lights, her robes the color of deep forest canopy. She moved with the certainty of someone who had never been told no, whose judgments carried the weight of policy and law. Behind her came the delegation. 5 members of the Culinary Preservation Council. Their species varied, their expressions unified in disdain. They wore the silver sashes that marked them as arbiters of taste, guardians of galactic gastronomy. And at Valora's right hand walked Kess, barely into adulthood, her crystalline skin refracting light into rainbow shards across the walls. Kess was a prodigy. Everyone knew her name. At 16, she'd redesigned the nutritional matrices for 3 systems. Her papers on molecular flavor optimization had been translated into 42 languages. She moved through the world with the particular cruelty of genius that had never faced limitation. Garrett straightened instinctively, wiping his hands on his apron. Sayuri slipped from her stool, the recipe book hidden behind her back, and moved closer to her father. The delegation's eyes swept the kitchen with the efficiency of scanners cataloging wreckage. Valora's gaze lingered on the fryer, on the industrial shelving holding flour and sugar in containers that had seen better decades, on the single flickering light above the prep station. Her expression revealed nothing, but her stillness spoke volumes. Garrett Hayes, she said, her voice carrying the crisp articulation of someone who'd learned galactic standard from diplomats. Human. Classification. Food service. Level 3. Yes, magistrate. His voice came out steady. Small mercy. Kess stepped forward, her movements sharp with impatience. She lifted a hand scanner and swept it across the kitchen, data streaming across its surface in languages Garrett couldn't read. Her lip curled, subtle but unmistakable. Primitive thermal apparatus, she announced to the delegation. No molecular synthesizers, no precision, temperature controls. He's using combustion-based heating. She said it the way someone might say he's using rocks and sticks. Laughter rippled through the council members. A Corvath delegate's multiple eyes blinked in sequence. A Threxian clicked his mandibles, the sound like breaking glass. Garrett said nothing. Cieri's small hand found his, her 3 fingers wrapping around 2 of his own. Kess moved to the cooling rack, where the last batch of donuts sat. She picked one up between 2 fingers, as if it might contaminate her, held it to the light, examining it the way a scientist might examine a primitive tool in a museum. "Fried dough," she said, her voice dripping with contempt. "He's making fried dough. No nutritional optimization, no flavor mapping, no structural integrity beyond basic gluten matrices." She looked at Valora. "This is what we're here to evaluate. This is what Earth calls cuisine." The delegation murmured agreement. One took notes on a glowing tablet. Another captured images, documenting the inadequacy for official reports. Valora remained silent, but her eyes had shifted from the kitchen to Garrett himself. There was something in her gaze, a searching quality that made him uncomfortable. Kess dropped the donut back onto the rack with theatrical disgust. Wasteful, artless, inefficient. She turned to face Garrett fully. Why should the station continue allocating resources to this operation? Garrett opened his mouth, closed it, the silence stretched. Then Cieri stepped forward. Cieri's voice cut through the silence like a bell through fog, clear and unexpected. "Because you've never tasted real food." The delegation froze. Kess's crystalline features sharpened with something between amusement and outrage. No one spoke to council members this way, especially not children, especially not in defense of the obsolete. Velora's eyes narrowed, but she didn't interrupt. She watched the small purple girl with an intensity that made Garrett's stomach drop. "Cieri," he whispered, a warning wrapped in fear. But his daughter's hand had already left his. She stood alone between the friar and the delegation, the recipe book clutched against her chest like a shield. "Real food takes time," Cieri continued, her voice steady despite her size. "It takes hands that care. It takes knowing when something's ready, not because a scanner tells you, but because you can hear it, feel it, see it." She looked directly at Kess. "My father knows these things. My mother taught him." Kess laughed, bright and cutting. "Your mother? Let me guess. Another human with delusions of—" "She was Veari," Cieri said quietly. The laughter stopped. The delegation exchanged glances. A human married to a Veari was unusual enough. A Veari teaching a human anything about cuisine was nearly unheard of. Their species had dominated 3 systems culinary institutions for generations. Valora's stillness had changed quality. She leaned forward slightly, and Garrett saw something flicker across her face. Recognition, or perhaps memory. "What was her name?" Valora asked, her voice softer than it had been. "Liana Esch," Cieri answered. "She died 2 years ago when the transport shuttle lost pressure in Sector 7. The name hung in the air like smoke. Garrett watched Valora's green skin pale by several shades, watched her hand rise unconsciously to her throat, where her fingers found a small pendant hidden beneath her robes. She didn't speak, but her breathing had changed. Shallow, careful. Kess, impatient with the digression, waved a dismissive hand. "Tragic, I'm sure. But sentiment doesn't change efficiency ratings. This kitchen is scheduled for decommissioning. The human will be reassigned to waste management, and the space will be—" "I challenge that assessment," Cieri said. The delegation erupted in laughter. Even the Corvath, who'd been taking notes, paused to wheeze with amusement. A child challenging the Culinary Preservation Council was absurd on its face. But Valora raised her hand, and the laughter died as quickly as it had begun. She descended 3 steps, bringing herself closer to Cieri's level, and studied the girl with an expression Garrett couldn't read. "You challenge our assessment," Valora repeated slowly. "On what grounds?" "On the grounds that you haven't actually evaluated the food." Cieri's ears twitched with nervousness, but her voice remained firm. "You've evaluated the equipment. The methods. But you haven't tasted what my father makes. Kes scoffed. We don't need to taste primitive fried dough to, then you're afraid. Siri interrupted. The silence that followed was absolute. Challenging a council member's courage was either bravery or suicide. Kes's crystalline skin flushed with color. Afraid? Of what? That you'll be wrong, Siri said simply. Valora's lips curved. Not quite a smile, but something close. She straightened, and when she spoke, her voice carried official weight. Very well. A formal evaluation. She gestured to Garrett. You will prepare your best work. The council will taste and deliver judgment. If you fail, this kitchen closes permanently. Garrett's hands trembled as he reached for the flour. Not from fear, though fear lived in his chest like a stone. Not from doubt, though doubt whispered that he'd forgotten everything that mattered. His hands trembled because they remembered what his heart had buried, and the awakening hurt like blood returning to a sleeping limb. Siri placed the recipe book on the prep station between them. She opened it to the page marked with the dried flour, her small fingers reverent against the yellowed paper. Heritage rings. Her mother's careful script, the diagrams drawn with love and precision, the marginal notes in 3 languages. You can do this, Papa, she whispered, so quiet only he could hear. The delegation had arranged themselves in a semicircle, witnesses to what they assumed would be failure. Kes stood at the front, her crystalline features sharp with anticipation. She'd already prepared her report in her mind. Garrett could tell. Already chosen the words that would dismiss him. Only Valora stood apart, her green fingers still touching the pendant at her throat. She watched, not with mockery, but with something that looked dangerously close to hope. Garrett pulled the mixing bowl toward him. The metal was cool under his palms, worn smooth by decades of use. He measured flour by weight and feel, the way Lyanna had taught him. Not with scanners, not with digital precision, with hands that learned to listen. The delegation murmured, primitive, inefficient, guesswork. But Siri smiled, because she recognized the rhythm, the way his shoulders moved as he sifted, the angle of his wrist as he cracked eggs into a smaller bowl. These were the movements her mother had described in the recipe book's margins, the ones that couldn't be written down because they lived in muscle and memory. He added milk, sugar, salt. His fingers found the butter, and he worked it into the flour with a patience he'd forgotten he possessed. The dough began to come together, reluctant at first, then willing. It spoke to him in textures, too dry, more milk, too wet, more flour. A conversation conducted in silence. Kes checked her scanner, bored. The Korvath delegate yawned, all 5 eyes closing in sequence. But Valora had moved closer. She stood at the edge of the prep station now, watching Garrett's hands with an intensity that made the air feel thin. She saw something the others didn't, recognized something they couldn't. Garrett began to knead, not aggressively, not quickly, with the steady pressure of tides, the patient rhythm of seasons. Push, fold, turn, push, fold, turn. The dough transformed under his hands, became elastic and alive. It breathed, actually breathed, rising and falling with each fold. Siri heard it too, the small sighs her mother had told her to listen for. She looked up at her father, and tears brightened her large eyes. That's it, she whispered. That's the sound. Garrett's vision blurred. He didn't stop kneading, couldn't stop, because his hands remembered everything now. Every lesson, every laugh. Every morning Lyanna had stood beside him in their small apartment kitchen, her green hands guiding his human ones, teaching him that cuisine wasn't about complexity. It was about love made edible. The dough rested under a clean cloth, rising in the warmth of the kitchen like a secret preparing to reveal itself. Garrett checked it with fingertips, not scanners. Pressed gently, felt the resistance. The springback that meant yeast and time had done their work. The delegation watched with the patience of predators who knew their prey had nowhere to run. He shaped the dough with hands that moved like prayer, rolled it to precise thickness, not measured by instruments but by the way light passed through when he held it up. Too thick, and the interior would stay dense. Too thin, and it would burn before cooking through. Liana had taught him to trust his eyes, to remember that cooking was a conversation between heat and time, and the cook who mediated between them. He cut rings with a simple cutter, nothing fancy. The centers he set aside, small circles that would become donut holes. Waste nothing, Liana used to say. Everything has purpose, if you're patient enough to find it. Kes scoffed audibly. He's using manual cutting tools. The irregularity alone will compromise structural integrity. But Valora said nothing. Her eyes tracked each movement, each choice, as if reading a text written in a language she'd thought extinct. The fryer oil heated slowly. Garrett tested it the old way, dropping a small piece of dough into the shimmering surface. It sank, then rose, bubbling gently. The color of the bubbles, the sound they made, the speed of the rise, all of it told him what he needed to know. 375 degrees. Perfect. He slid the first ring into the oil with a gentleness that bordered on reverence. It sank into gold, and the kitchen filled with a scent that made even the Korvath delegates' eyes snap open. Not the harsh smell of burnt grease they'd expected. Something warmer, richer, a sweetness that carried underneath it the complexity of wheat and butter and time. Sieri stood on her toes to watch. The dough ring darkened, transformed, became something other than its parts. Garrett turned it with a slotted spoon, and the uncooked side met heat, even browning. No dark spots, no pale patches, just golden uniformity achieved through attention rather than automation. The delegation had gone quiet, not mocking, not bored, quiet in the way people go quiet when they witness something unexpected. He lifted the first donut from the oil and set it on a rack to drain. Steam rose from its surface, and the exterior crackled faintly as it cooled. He repeated the process, one ring at a time, patient, methodical, the rhythm of someone who understood that rushing ruined everything. Kes checked her scanner again, but her movements had lost their certainty. The readings made no sense. The chemical composition was simple, unremarkable, but the scent filling the kitchen spoke of something her instruments couldn't quantify. Valora's hand had left her pendant. Both hands now gripped the edge of the prep station, knuckles pale against green skin. She was waiting. They all were. For the moment when simplicity would reveal itself as something far more dangerous than complexity. The final donut emerged from the oil like a small sun being born. Garrett lifted it with the slotted spoon, let the excess oil drain back into the fryer, and placed it on the rack beside its siblings. 12 perfect rings, golden and gleaming, steam curling from their surfaces in lazy spirals that carried scent like a message written in warmth. He worked quickly now, muscle memory guiding him through the final steps. A light dusting of sugar, applied while the donuts were still warm enough for it to adhere. Not too much, just enough to catch light and tongue in equal measure. Then a glaze, simple and classic, made from powdered sugar and milk and a drop of vanilla extract he'd been saving for 2 years, waiting for a moment that mattered. The glaze fell across the donuts in thin curtains, settled into glossy pools, and began to set almost immediately. The transformation was alchemical. What had been simple fried dough became something that reflected light like stained glass, that promised texture and sweetness, and the kind of satisfaction that had nothing to do with nutritional optimization. Sieri clasped her hands together, the recipe book pressed between them. Her eyes shone with tears she refused to let fall. She'd seen her father make donuts 1,000 times, but never like this. Never with the fullness of who he'd been before grief had hollowed him out. Garrett arranged the donuts on a simple, white plate. No garnish, no architectural ambition, just 12 rings placed with care. Their imperfect circles, somehow more honest than machine precision would have allowed. He set the plate on the prep station and stepped back. The delegation moved forward as one organism, drawn by curiosity or hunger or the simple human and alien need to understand what their senses were insisting mattered. Kess reached out first, her crystalline fingers hovering above the nearest donut. She hesitated, and in that hesitation lived the first crack in her certainty. But it was Valora who touched first. Her green hand, steady until this moment, trembled as she lifted a donut from the plate. It was still warm, the glaze caught light and threw it back in soft refractions. She held it close to her face, inhaling deeply, and something in her expression collapsed. Recognition, memory, grief. She brought the donut to her lips with the reverence of someone handling a relic. The first bite was small, careful, as if she feared what it might confirm. Her teeth broke through the glazed exterior with a faint crack, met the tender interior, and her eyes closed. The delegation watched her, confused by her stillness. Kess frowned, impatient for the magistrate to deliver the dismissal they'd all come to witness. But Valora didn't speak. She chewed slowly, and tears began to slide down her green cheeks, catching in the fine scales along her jawline. Her hand rose to cover her mouth, and a sound escaped her throat. Not quite a sob, not quite a laugh. Something older than either. She opened her eyes and looked directly at Garrett. "Where did you learn this?" she whispered. Garrett's throat tightened. The question hung in the kitchen like smoke, impossible to ignore. Valora's tears hadn't stopped, and the delegation had gone completely silent, watching their magistrate break protocol in ways that made no sense to any of them. "My wife taught me," Garrett said quietly. "Lyanna," she said, these were made the way her teacher had shown her. Old methods, patient methods. Valora set the half-eaten donut down with shaking hands. She reached for her pendant again, pulled it free from beneath her robes. It was small, teardrop-shaped, filled with liquid that shimmered green and gold. She held it out so the light caught it, and inside the liquid floated 3 words in Vayari script. Siri gasped. She knew those words. They were written on the first page of her mother's recipe book, a dedication she'd never fully understood. "For my teacher," Siri whispered, translating, "who taught me that feeding someone is the first form of love." Valora's composure shattered completely. She pressed the pendant to her chest and looked at Siri with an expression that held 20 years of grief. "I gave this to her the day she told me she was leaving to marry a human. I thought I'd never see her again. I thought everything I'd taught her would be lost." The delegation erupted in whispers. Kess stepped forward, her crystalline features sharp with confusion. "Magistrate, you knew this human's wife?" "I trained her," Valora said, her voice steady despite the tears. "Lyanna Esh was my finest student, the most talented chef I ever taught. She could have led academies, reformed entire culinary systems." She looked at Garrett, and something like awe entered her expression. "And she chose to teach you instead." Kess picked up a donut now, her movements no longer dismissive but uncertain. She bit into it, and her eyes widened. The texture was impossibly light, the interior soft as cloud, the exterior providing just enough resistance to make the contrast meaningful. The sweetness was perfect, not overwhelming but present, balanced by the richness of butter and the subtle complexity of properly fermented dough. "This shouldn't be possible," Kess said, staring at the donut as if it had betrayed her. "The temperature variations alone should compromise consistency. The manual shaping should create structural weakness. But it's—" She trailed off, unable to finish. "Perfect," Valora finished for her, "because he's not following protocols. He's following principles. There's a difference." The other delegates tasted now, one by one. The Korvath's 5 eyes blinked in astonishment. The Threxian's mandibles went still. Even the note-taker set down his tablet to use both hands, holding the donut like something precious. Siri moved to her father's side and took his hand. He looked down at her. This small purple girl who'd believed in him when he'd stopped believing in himself. "Mama knew," Siri whispered. "She knew you'd remember when it mattered." Valora wiped her eyes and straightened her robes. When she spoke again, her voice carried the weight of official judgment. "This changes everything." Kess set her half-eaten donut down with hands that had lost their certainty. She looked at Valora, then at Garrett, then at the small purple girl whose eyes held knowledge beyond her years. Even if his technique is sound, even if his teacher was exceptional, this is still inefficient, still primitive. One human can't possibly justify the resource allocation when synthesizers could. My mama said you'd say that, Siri interrupted. The delegation turned to her as one. The girl stepped forward, the recipe book held open now, no longer hidden. She found a page near the back where her mother's handwriting had grown smaller, more urgent, as if she'd been racing against time to record everything that mattered. She wrote this 3 days before she died, Siri said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. She said, if Papa ever stopped cooking, I should read it to him. But I think you need to hear it too. Valora descended from her place among the delegation and knelt before the child, bringing herself to Siri's level. Read it, little one. Siri's voice filled the kitchen, clear and strong, reading her mother's words. To whoever finds this book, know that I did not teach Garrett techniques alone. I taught him why technique matters. I taught him that food is memory made edible, that every meal carries the weight of everyone who came before us. The galaxy has forgotten this. We've optimized nutrition until we've forgotten nourishment. We've perfected efficiency until we've lost the ability to feed souls. The Korvath delegate shifted uncomfortably. The Threxian's mandibles clicked, but softly now, thoughtfully. Siri continued. Garrett is not just a chef. He is a keeper of something the galaxy needs desperately to remember. That taking time is not waste. That imperfection is not failure. That the work of hands and hearts cannot be replaced by machines that have neither. Cass opened her mouth to argue, then closed it. Her scanner hung, forgotten at her side. I chose him not despite his humanity, but because of it. Siri read, tears now flowing freely down her purple cheeks. Because humans still remember what it means to hunger for more than calories. They remember that a meal shared is a story told, that teaching someone to cook is teaching them to love. And I knew that even if the galaxy forgot me, it couldn't forget what I taught him, because he would feed it, one donut at a time, one patient morning after another, until someone finally stopped long enough to taste. Siri closed the book and looked up at Valora. My papa didn't stop cooking because he forgot how. He stopped because it hurt to remember. But he remembered today. For me. And now you've tasted what my mama wanted the galaxy to taste. Valora reached out and touched the child's face with infinite gentleness. Your mother was wiser than all of us. She stood and faced the delegation. I'm recommending immediate reclassification. The changes came slowly at first, the way dawn arrives in degrees rather than declarations. Station Arcturus didn't transform overnight, but within 3 months, the sub-level commissary had been redesigned. New equipment, better ventilation, proper lighting that didn't flicker. But Garrett kept the old fryer. It knew things newer ones didn't. Valora had done more than reclassify him. She'd built a culinary institute around him, naming it the Liana Esh Memorial Academy. Students came from 7 systems to learn what the magistrate called heritage cooking. The techniques that had been dismissed as primitive until a widowed chef and his daughter had proven otherwise. Garrett taught 3 classes a week, small groups, never more than 10 students. He showed them how to listen to dough, how to read heat, how to trust their hands over their scanners. Many struggled. Some quit. But the ones who stayed learned to cook with a patience the galaxy had forgotten existed. Siri became the youngest teaching assistant in academy history. At 7 years old, she moved through the kitchen with authority, correcting a Threxian's kneading technique, showing a Vayari how to test oil temperature by sound. She wore a small apron embroidered with her mother's name, and she carried the recipe book everywhere, its pages more worn now, more loved. Kes returned on the first day of the 2nd term. She stood at the doorway of the teaching kitchen, her crystalline features uncertain in a way they'd never been before. Garrett saw her and simply nodded toward an empty station. She took her place among the students without a word. By the end of the term, She could make donuts that would have made Liana proud. Not perfect, but honest. Imperfect circles that tasted like humility and growth in equal measure. The station's dining halls began to change. Synthesizers still provided efficient nutrition, but now restaurants opened that served food made by hands, by beings who took time. A Korvath bakery, a Threxian noodle house, a human cafe where Garrett's donuts sold out every morning before the second shift began. Valora visited often. She'd sit at the counter in the teaching kitchen, watching students work, occasionally closing her eyes when the scent of rising dough filled the air. Once, Garrett found her crying silently, a donut untouched on the plate before her. "I miss her," Valora said simply. "So do I," Garrett replied. "Every day. But she's here," Siri added, appearing between them with flour on her purple cheeks. "Every time someone learns, every time they taste, every time they remember that food is love." Valora smiled through her tears and pulled the child into an embrace. On the wall behind the teaching stations, Garrett had mounted a single page from Liana's recipe book, framed and lit. Not a recipe, but a note written in her careful hand. "Feed them well, feed them truly, and they will remember what it means to be alive." The kitchen remembered, and in remembering, taught the galaxy to do the same.